Hello everyone, welcome to the lecture regarding coding conventions and guidelines. In today's contents, we're going to discuss coding conventions and PEP8, which is a style guide for Python, and some concepts in PEP8. Coding convention is a set of guidelines specific for a programming language that recommend programming style, practices, and methods for each aspect of program. And why do we need to use them? Because to improve the readability, that makes it easier and faster to understand, and also for code maintenance because it's a big part of software's life, and it is rare that software is maintained by the original code author. This means that throughout the software's life, the others might change, so using coding conventions makes it easier for code maintenance. And also to improve the code quality, peer review is often includes reading source which is submitted to a project. This is also ties back to improve the readability and to keep our code consistent. So let's talk about PEP8 is a style guide for Python, and we can talk about code layout. First thing is indentation, so which is done with 4 spaces. This could be configured to treat input as 4 spaces from the tab key, and Python 3 prohibits the mixing of using tabs and spaces for indentation. While working on code maintenance, we can keep the indentation style which is used originally or previous code. So here is an example which the code has indentation for print statement. So let's look at the indentation for functions. So here is the example that shows don't and do's. So when we have a argument in a function which does not fit in one line, we can use either use these two, one of those here. The first thing we can have we can align the arguments with the opening delimiter like this here, or we can also use the hanging indent with an extra indentation. Here you see there are 2 indentations, which that means 8 spaces, and without any arguments in the first line. Now we can look for a if statement. Indentation for if statement. There are no rules how to handle the case for multi-line conditional. So, but here are 3 options that we can use. The first thing is we can just use as it is, write a condition and then the statement what it does. Or option 2, we can actually add a comment to distinguish between the conditions and what the code does here. Or option 3, we can have an extra indentation here, so to separate the condition and the statement that it does. Now we can see indentation for closing brackets for multi-line construct here. We can do it in 2 ways here as it's shown. So the first with the first non-white space character here of the last line of the construct here, and then also under the first character of the last line we can close the brackets. So next we can go to the maximum line length in code layout. So a line should not be longer than 79 characters. For the flowing text like comments and docstrings, this limit lies 72 characters instead. So if we have a long lines which is divided up between multi-lines by wrapping them in parentheses, for example here as shown in the example here. This is preferred over using the black slashes for line construction here. Now we can talk about code layout for how we can place blank lines. So when we have a top level functions and classes, we can use 2 blank lines, and also an extra blank line can be used to cluster related functions together. And also we can place blank lines should be in the functions to show clear steps as shown here in the example. So here we want to show the clear steps in functions. Now we can talk about imports in code layout. So import should be on separate lines and always be put together on top of the file in Python file. So just after any module level docstrings, for example, as we discussed in our previous video, we have documentation for the code. So this is the import needs to be just after the docstrings and also before the any module level globals and or constants. And also this can be divided into groups. For example, when we have a standard libraries, we can import them, and then we can separate them with the imports that are from third-party imports and also our local modules. Absolute imports are recommended since they are more readable, and wildcard imports, for example, when we have a from a module import star, these kind of things should be avoided because they do not give a clear names that are present in the namespaces, so confusing readers. So here is an example. You could see here are the ones that are the standard modules, and then this is the one which is the third party module, and this is the one that we have we have created our own module here. So now we can talk about strings in coding conventions for strings. So we can use both single quotations and double quotations for Python to denote string. But PEP8 does not recommend using one over other. Instead, it is recommended to choose one, and we can stick with that. But if strings contains either single quotation or double quotation internally, then we can use one another. For example, here in this example, you see here I don't has a single quotation. In this case, we can use double quotation to denote a string here. And also here, someone said this is silly. Here, this is silly as a quote, so we can use a single quotation instead to denote the string here. Now we can talk about white spaces in PEP8. So PEP8 strongly recommends that extra white spaces should not be placed. This is, for example, directly before and after parentheses, brackets, and braces, and also before comma, semicolon, or colon, and between trailing comma and closing parentheses, and also before the opening parentheses of function call, or also to align the variable declarations. Here I have an example what I meant here with these steps, with these points. Also, the trailing white spaces should always be removed. Trailing white space means that a space between the end of the line of the code placed before the new line. So here is an example for the spaces to avoid. The first one is like we have a space here, and also before the colon, and also before here after the brackets. So this should be avoided, and instead it should be written in this way here. And also to align a variable, we don't need to have an extra space here. So we can do in this way. There is a situation where one white space can be added before and after the colon, which is in slices for slicing. And it is important to note that white space should be placed both before and after the colon, not just before or after. So that to exception to this, we can if the slice parameter after or before the colon is omitted, we can remove the space. So for example, here you see an example for the slicing. There is no space here, but if we are ignoring the one that as I said, so then here we don't have to have space before the colon. So here also a white space is added before and after the binary operations for assignments and augmented assignments, comparisons, and booleans. Here is an example for that. So you see here also for the lower priority to distinguish, to separate the operators with the lower priority from the ones with the higher priority here, as it's shown here. And now we can talk about when to use trailing commas. So trailing commas refers to a comma at the end of the series of values in an array or an array-like object, leaving an empty slot. So these are usually optional, only being mandatory when making a tuple with one element. For clarity, this should be surrounded by parentheses as shown here in the example. And also, while optional, trailing commas can be used for lists and arguments that are expected to be extended in the future. Simply place each item on the separate line and then closing brackets on the next line with the comma before it, as shown here in the example. So now we can talk about naming conventions in PEP8. So when we code in Python, we name a lot of things. For example, variables, functions, classes, and so on. So sticking with the naming convention is very important for writing code because it is easy to read and maintain. So one of the most important things to remember when naming functions, classes, and variables that are visible to the user is to make sure that these names describe usage but not the implementation. For example, I have a function called function is sort here, but I also in the don't example, it also provide the information about the implementation sort with quick sort, but we don't need to have that. We don't need to provide that information. Instead, we can describe usage for sorting. Now we can talk about the naming convention styles. So there are many different naming styles we can use in Python programming in general, but most commonly used here are listed lowercase or lowercase with underscore, or uppercase with the underscore, or mixed case or camel case. So when using acronym, for example, SQL is an acronym for structural query language. And if you want to use camel case for this naming for the style, then we can keep the uppercase for the entire acronym. For example, as shown here in the example, SQL query. So naming conventions for special forms. So in Python, there is a special meaning with the variables that has leading and trailing underscores. Namely, here I have listed a single leading underscore that indicates the internal use, and wildcode imports, when we have a wildcode imports, they will not import these. For example, here this is how it looks, the trailing leading underscore, the first one here, leading underscore. And also a single trailing underscore can be used not to conflict with the keywords. For example, a class is a keyword in Python. So, but if you want to use a class as a variable name as well, then we can use a trailing comma here, as it's shown here in this example. We can use the trailing comma. And also a double leading underscore is used to hide the class variables. So a double leading and double trailing underscore they marks a magic object or attributes which live in the user control namespaces. For example, as shown here, these three. So new variables should never be created with this form. So naming conventions name to avoid, for example, do not use a single character for variable names, as shown here. Example, lowercase L to indicate like one character, or uppercase O, so on and so on. So these characters also indistinguishable from the numeral ones and zeros in some fonts. So now we can talk about naming conventions. For I have listed how we can use it modules and other things as well. So if you have a module, so they're usually written in module lowercase, for example here, or if we have two words, we can have underscore between them. And also the functions and variables we need to use lowercase. If we have more than one word, then we can use underscore. And for the global variables, we can use a leading underscore here, as you've seen. So they are not exported from the modules they reside in. And for the constant variables, we need to use uppercase letters. And when we have a class, then we can use a class is written in camel case, for example here my class, and method is written in lowercase words. And if we can now use if we have more than one word, we can use underscore. And for packages, they're usually written in short lowercase word or words. So for example, here I have an example what not to do and what to do. So constant variable, as I said, it has to be all uppercase. And also when we have a global variable, as I mentioned before, we need to have underscore before the variable name here. So, and also for the functions with the function names, if we have more than one word, we need to have underscore between the lowercase letters. So note here is a note that PEP8 explicitly states that the libraries in Python are a bit of mess when it comes to the naming conventions, but the currently set naming convention should be used for all code in this course. So here are the references. If I have covered the naming conventions and guidelines that we were going to use, but if you want to have if you want to know more information, you can visit python.org for for more information on coding conventions and guidelines and PEP8. So yeah, that's what I want to explain in this lecture. So thank you for your attention.